Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Shpilova-Said and Ania Abramyan is joining me today. Our speaker is Dr. Jessica Zychowicz, who presents on her recently published book, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine. Jessica Zychowicz is currently based at the University of Alberta in the Contemporary Ukraine Studies program. This event today is co-organized by Ukrainian Studies Organization and by Russian and East European Institute. Our talk today is moderated by Dr. Sarah Phillips. Dr. Sarah Phillips is Professor of Anthropology at IU and Director of the Russian and East European Institute. Her primary interests are in sociocultural and medical anthropology, especially gender and health, disability, addiction, and HIV-AIDS. She has conducted research in Ukraine since 1995, most recently on HIV prevention programs for people who use drugs, especially women. She published a number of articles as well as 2 books, Disability and Mobile Citizenship in Post-Socialist Ukraine, and Women's Social Activism in the New Ukraine, Development and the Politics of Differentiation. So we will start with Dr. Zychowicz's lecture. Please submit our comments and questions via the Q&A option, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. All questions and comments will be addressed during our discussion. At this point, I'll pass the floor to Sarah. Thank you so much for moderating our lecture today, Sarah.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you, Ani. Congratulations on what has been a wonderful lecture series this semester, sponsored by the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. And thank you for inviting me to moderate today's talk and introduce our speaker, my colleague, my friend, Dr. Jessica Zychowicz. Wonderful to see you, Jessica. So I'm going to start out by introducing Dr. Zychowicz and say just a few words about her wonderful book and kind of situate the project a little bit. And then we look forward to hearing your talk and your slideshow. So Dr. Jessica Zychowicz earned her doctorate in Slavic Studies at the University of Michigan, where I also noticed she was in the first cohort of the University of Michigan Initiative in Digital Humanities. And when she starts talking about her research, you'll find out why that is really important and exciting. She also holds a BA in English literature and a minor in political theory from the University of California at Berkeley. Again, this is important because, as you'll see, her research is deeply interdisciplinary and it's really informed by all of these approaches and more. Dr. Zychowicz was a U.S. Fulbright Scholar in Area Studies in 2017-2018 to the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which of course is in Kyiv, Ukraine. She's currently based, as Natalia mentioned, at the University of Alberta in the Contemporary Ukraine Studies program. She's been a fellow at many universities and institutions, among them the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. She's been a visiting scholar at Uppsala University's Institute for Russian and East European Studies in Sweden. She has participated in talks and residencies at the University of St. Andrews in Edinburgh, and also at New York University's Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. And that's just a few of the residencies and fellowships that she has had. She is a scholar who is in great demand, and we're really lucky that we were able to land you today to talk about your brand new book. I'm proud to show everyone that I have this wonderful book. I've had the chance to read it. It's lovely. Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine. And of course, the super title is Superfluous Women. And I know Dr. Zychowicz is going to explain that title to us and why she is gave the book this mysterious and very theoretically and historically rich title, Superfluous Women. So I've had the pleasure to read the book. It is tremendously innovative. And it really tells a unique story of a generation of artists, of feminists, and queer activists who emerged in Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There is a really fabulous focus on new media in the book, and Dr. Zychowicz demonstrates how contemporary artist collectives in Ukraine have contested Soviet and Western connotations of feminism to draw attention to a range of human rights issues with global impact. And I want to just point out a few of the key characteristics of the book that I appreciated in particular. One is that we have a focus on a particular generation of art activists, and these are activists that Dr. Zychowicz calls the inter-revolutionary generation. At the same time, she draws these really fascinating links back to the notion and practice of art collectives in the 1920s in the Soviet avant-garde. And so there's this fascinating kind of historic back and forth in the book that I find very, very rich and productive. And I hope you'll talk a little bit about that today. I mentioned that the book is deeply interdisciplinary, and it draws on art history, anthropology, sociology, performance studies, gender and feminist studies, of course, memory studies, and cultural studies. And it draws on the methods and the theories of these disciplines to really excavate particular works of art and performance, to historicize them and contextualize them, to draw out influence that maybe are unexpected, and to track reworkings of themes, ideas, debates and contestations around women, gender, feminism. The focus is on the performative nature of gender and how the body, gender, and sexuality are central objects and space for contestation and meaning making. And finally, the book is informed by a deep engagement with scholars in Ukraine, scholars of Ukraine, and also deep engagements with the very artists and activists that Dr. Zychowicz is centering in her analysis. And so that's sort of one side of the engagement, but the other really important side of the engagement, and I think we're all enacting that today, is that Dr. Zychowicz is bringing this art, this activism, these performances to new audiences, right? So she's introducing these art collectives to scholarly audiences that maybe are not familiar with the Ukrainian context, maybe not familiar with this part of the world, but are familiar with, art activism in other contexts. And so there's this wonderful dialogue, I think, sort of on multiple levels that the book really draws out. So thank you again for being here, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I also want to, in the interest of digital humanities and building networks and interdisciplinarity, I will give a quick shout out to HNet Ukraine, which I have a sticker here that has been given to me from the network. They are based in Michigan, but they have, support from all over. I encourage everyone to send information that way. And I'm now part of HNet Ukraine. So I'm really trying to strengthen our interdisciplinarity and visibility on all of our work through this network. I will go ahead and share my screen because I want to show some images from the book. Here we go. Let's see. So So here is the cover of my book and contact info. You can contact me through my website or my current institution, University of Alberta. I am starting with this photo because it's really positioned in a place and time that most audiences in the West would know or have encountered through the mass media about Ukraine after 2014, the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. This was a message that activists on the Maidan towards the end of events, right before Easter time, had created using upturned cobblestones that had been part of the barricades. The message, I think, is presented to attract attention from satellite, from media cameras above. It says, "Stop propaganda, there is no fascism here. Patriotism is the idea of the Maidan." 2014 was well before the terms propaganda and information war really began to circulate in the West in the contexts of our own nations. And I include this image because I want to show how Ukraine at that time in 2014 was really at a crossroads for discussions, global discussions that now have so much relevance. So if we look back at this moment and then go even farther back throughout the 2000s, which I'm doing in my book, I think we can find stories and narratives that we can all relate to and learn from, without weaponizing terms like fascism and dark aspects of our histories. We can work through those histories. I include here an image from my own context. I'm from the US originally, and this is media action that was created in the 1970s by artists Suzanne Lacey and Leslie Labovich, who still are practicing in mostly New York area through the media. But the 1970s were important for feminist activism. Many people trace the larger panoply of engagements, not only through media and art, but also through meetings at the UN and massive conferences, to a second wave of feminism. Second wave feminism is usually how this era is discussed. I'm trying to get away from waves in my book when I'm talking about the feminist aspects of the works I'm looking at. And I'm really trying to build continuity and looking also at the suffragists from the 1920s and the early avant-gardes, trying to find what has been sustained through conversations that center on bodies, on legal categories, and the legislation of gender. Woman being a category that is enacted in law, but is also contested by the performance of non-binary genders. Here, this particular media action was created to bring attention to a rape case under consideration at the Los Angeles court system. And this was the Los Angeles City Hall that Lacey and Labovich decided to stage their action in front of. But what I'm really interested in pointing out in this image is the completely clothed body, that the concealment of the body here before media cameras with these striking red capes, almost in a kind of witch-like fashion, is a way of attracting attention from the camera that departs from consumerist images of maybe models or fashion, this sort of sale of female sexuality in the interests of business and others elsewhere. So here is another image that the West would be familiar with, because this was the World Press Photo winner of 2013 of a Femin activist, Femin being one of several different groups that I discuss in my book, hailing from Ukraine. Femin stayed in Ukraine from their founding around 2009 until 2011, when they moved abroad to Paris. And that shift abroad, that move was really propelled by an action that this particular activist here, Ina Shevchenko, did in the center of Kyiv, where she saw down a cross and had claimed that she was doing so in solidarity with Pussy Riot's action at the same time, or just after they had been put on trial in Russia. I look at that a little bit in my book. I don't compare Pussy Riot and Femin extensively in my book. I do look at them on the same plane, but I have a new article coming out with my colleague Natalia Chermalich about Femin and Pussy Riot through a more comparative lens in the Routledge Handbook to Gender and Social Movements in Central and Eastern Europe. That will be coming out next year. But what I want to show here is the role of the media and the innovation behind Femin's early work in playing with both the revealing of the body before cameras and to get a lot of attention from the media, but also images, signs connected to a sort of Slavic femaleness or femininity that is recontextualized in their performances. This is also a World Press Photo winner. This is from 2012, and it's of a sex worker from Kryvyi Rih. It was staged, the photo was staged by the wife of the oligarch Viktor Pinchuk, because she has a large NGO. And I wanted to include this in my book alongside this World Press Photo image and this World Press Photo image from 2011, because they're all next to each other, 2011, 2012, 2013, to point out the different surfaces on mass media in the consumption of images from, quote unquote, the East, to trouble the binaries between East and West. This picture is probably the most famous out of all three of them. And it is of a woman holding her son, who was an anti-government protester against the regime in Yemen at the time, which was a very brutal regime. And they are inside of a mosque, which has been turned into a field hospital. The connection in the salience now of this image, looking back at what happened on Maidan in 2014, is very interesting, because a lot of the churches there were also turned into field hospitals, and women were the ones who stepped in to offer care work. I don't go so far as to analyze this particular image in great depth in my book, because I make the connection through the feminine activist Oksana Sashko, who before her suicide in Paris actually created a replica of this icon. It was one of the last things that she left before her passing away. And you can see the activist in the left image. The original has been replaced with a Baroque style angel that you might find in a Ukrainian, traditional Ukrainian icon. Oksana Sachko was painting on wood. She was painting these images, these icons, in a traditional way, using gold paint on wood, but she was inserting into them more contemporary commentary on her own life circumstances, like the juxtaposition here between the fallen woman smoking and drinking versus the angelic is interesting. And I think that in my book, I'm looking a lot at different archetypes of women being either saviors or prostitutes, and different, stigmatizations of sex work versus fetishization in literature and culture in the 19th century, and then again in the 20th, which Eric Nyman has written beautifully about in his book called Sex in Public, about the early Bolshevik legislation of sexuality and how that really impacted cultural understandings of what the category woman was and what it has become today, and how different sort of interventions in what is acceptable behavior or taboo behavior starts to change perceptions of gender in our contemporary moment. So that is really where my first and second chapters are going in my book. My third chapter is a really different kind of approach to similar issues and questions around women's rights being reproductive rights, labor equality in hiring and firing, and discrimination in access to healthcare, access to housing. These are all issues that a different feminist collective very active at the same time as Femin in the 2010s called Feministyczna Ofensywa was dealing with in their interactions with society and also NGOs and universities. The members of Ofensywa were roughly 20 or 30 women working in all different sectors, and still most of them are very active with feminist and gender issues, but they are not affiliated anymore as a group, as a cohesive group. They disbanded on the Maidan in 2014 over a couple of different issues, which I talk a little bit about in my book. But I really, in my third chapter, am discussing Ofensywa as sort of the backdrop or the background for creative work that was produced by artists affiliated with their group, and thinking through this awkward term that now has been discussed interdisciplinarily and in both political science by Valerie Sperling in the Russian context, and also art and performance by Pyotr Petrovsky and others, called it art activist, right? What is this awkward term, art activist, and how does it depart from what might be called maybe socially engaged art from the 1920s, or nonconformist art from the Glasnost era and the 1990s, or underground art? What are these categories and why are we applying them to creative productions? And how do these different individuals navigating issues, social issues through their creative productions, how do they themselves look at those categories? This artist, Yevgenia Belarusets, uses forms from the 1920s by photographers such as Alexandra Rodchenko, who I compare her to directly in my book, to create kind of what I call visual ethnographies about different groups or people that she gets to know over several years. She spends a lot of time with the subjects in her photos, interviewing them, writing about them, and also she wrote a blog actually connected to this particular series called 32 Gogol Street. 32 Gogol Street is still in Kyiv. It's a building now vacant, but in 2011, when this series was made, it was occupied. It was lower income housing in the city, individual units. People were living in individual units, but the building before independence had been a communal dwelling, which is also interesting to see how it was converted both architecturally and socially. And that's a lot of what Yevgenia Belarusets, in my critique of her writing, what she's doing actually is thinking through the continuities of her grandmother's generation, a lot of the women in this building being elderly women, in their daily lives, and bringing that forward to a wider audience. This particular series traveled to the UK and won the Royal Photographic Society Award in London, which is incredible because it didn't really have much of a context for audiences there to quite understand the resonance of what was happening here. But the exterior of the building, as you can see here, it becomes a character in the series. The building itself starts to take on almost anthropomorphic tones. And this is in contrast to the laws of photography of the early Soviet era, where architectural form was very dynamic and was serving as an allegory for a progressive, teleological, forward marching future that was definitely a break with the past. It was forward looking. You did not look into the past in any Soviet art. It was constructivist. It was building something. And what a lot of the artists are doing in my book, all of them actually, except maybe the more performance-based art of Femin, is reworking these forms from the Soviet era into new frames that are, I would not put into the descriptor nostalgic, because there has been a lot of writing by Sergei Oshakin and others on nostalgia, but even nostalgia for another's nostalgia, a phantom limb or a prosthetic memory of a past that maybe they themselves didn't experience, but could offer alternative continuities that strengthen the marginalized, or what Sarah Phillips, whose work I cite in my book of the women in the 1990s, largely escaping this label of a loser of the transition, the losers of the transition being itself a kind of production of identity that can be rejected and navigated and circumlocuted in different ways. You can see exactly here, like, very strong example of the parallels and the departures in form. The fourth chapter of my book is featuring mostly the Visual Culture Research Center and the Revolutionary Experimental Space collectives, as well as the Hood Rada Curatorial Collective. And I use as a case study one particular collaboration with a curator from Austria and from Poland, in an exhibit called Disputed Territory. And this exhibit was important because it brought together 3 different collectives at the National Art Museum of Ukraine in 2013, about a month and a half before the revolution happened. And the title itself is almost a premonition of things to come. These pieces you see here are actually fragments from a dismantled mural that the different collectives had co-created inside of the museum. And at the end of the exhibit, they dismantled it and passed it away or gave it away to passersby. It evokes, in a way, the dismantling of the Berlin Wall, but it also brought to mind protest posters from an exhibit that was featured in London in 2007. This was a protest against the Iraq War that had been taking place for several years outside of the space of the museum, but then was moved in to it and created a kind of disruption in the line of what is permitted and not permitted as protest. Why? Because a month before this was moved inside of the museum, law was passed in Britain that prevented any kind of protest activity within a certain space of demarcation around the Houses of Parliament. And that space actually the demarcation line ran through the middle of the museum. So the protest was split. You can see in the photo, the demarcation line here. The protest straddled the line of legal and illegal protest. It was a performance of politics through the auspices of art that I think is very, very illustrative of the similar kinds of activities that the collectives today in Ukraine are engaging with regard to pushing sort of the boundaries of what is legislated as censorship, what is legislated as protest versus what is a peaceful legal, nonviolent expression of one's ideas. An illustrative example in chapter 5 that I include that could be thought of as well in terms of what the value of art is and who is deciding what art is valued both by the state and by audiences is an exhibit that happened after 2014. Two professional curators already affiliated with state museums created an exhibit inside the National Art Museum of Ukraine using all of the artifacts that had been stolen by the ousted President Viktor Yanukovych and stored in his estate in Mezhyhirya. Protesters on the Maidan did not destroy any of the items in Mezhyhirya. Instead, they put them into the museum and created this exhibit, which I attended. You can see a lot of the items actually are on display on the shipping crates in which they were transported in. So this was an exhibit created very quickly. And what's interesting here also is if you look at the history of museums in this part of the world, actually, the first museums were created after the imperial period, and it was the Bolsheviks who were seizing property and putting property into museums as a way of having some kind of discursive, not only discursive control over icons, for example, but also control over the value of certain artifacts. So after I'm not drawing a direct parallel in saying that the Maidan demonstrators were somehow enacting a Bolshevik tradition, and not at all, but I am pointing out that museums in this part of the world have a political immediacy and a history that is very different than museums and provenance in the Western context, which also is political, but we have to always remember that we're dealing with a completely different historical context. And in my book, I'm really digging into the finer tuned studies that have already been done on this. And I know there are others who are working now on this exact topic in Ukraine, and a film was just made about the National Museum of Ukraine and shown at the ACES conference. I think it's still available for the next week, so check that out if you have time. Again, here were more artifacts that had been transported from the Mezhyhirya estate to the National Art Museum of Ukraine. And in my 5th chapter, I look at this concept again of the interrevolutionary generation, and I will get to the title of my book. I will save it for the end. And I'm very much interested in the body and how the body has been such a central figure in really the last 10 years of contemporary art production in Ukraine. Here is a painting by the artist Lesia Homenko, who is a co-founder of the Revolutionary Experimental Space Collective. And you can see within the painting the blue sky over the yellow wheat field, clear identification with the national history of Ukraine. But it's also a complicated picture. It's a complicated image because it includes the forms from the early Soviet avant-garde. This was a very big painting. Lesia Homenko is trained as a monumental painter from the same school where Malevich was working, Tatlin was working, and those resonances are clear here as well in the scale of the painting, also the pastoral setting, the setting of a worker. But there's something else that has been changed, as in Yevgenia Belarusets' works, where she's changing the form to her own context. Here you see sneakers, and that is a change that has been made or inserted by the artist, but there's also the fact that bringing this kind of invisible, maybe marginalized identity of a rural villager into the center of art production in contemporary Ukraine in museums. This was displayed and exhibited in the National Museum, is a way of centering, again, centering populations that maybe have been relegated as not having won through the transition period, but are very much the backbone of Ukraine's sustenance today. The villages and the agricultural sectors of Ukraine being very integral to independence and to sustaining a national identity. And here again is a similar image, also centering on a grandmother figure and a fallen monument, almost a monument to a grandmother, in contrast perhaps to all of the fallen Lenins that were happening around the same time. This is from 2014. The artist is Vlada Rauko. She is a painter, and she often goes to the village of Taras Shevchenko from the 19th century near Kyiv to make her works. She goes to a residency there often, and she has been compared to him in the sense that she is creating a lot of sketches, a lot of drawings of her experiences, of the things she sees around her. Again, it's almost like a documentary process that she is engaged with, and this is her Kievsky Shodenik, her Kiev journal, from the experiences that she felt and observed on the Maidan in 2013, 2014. I will include a couple of images from 2018 when I went back to Ukraine after completing my majority of my research for my book. I was there teaching for a year with Fulbright, and I observed some of the memorialization 5 years onward from the Maidan. And what I noted was the most of all was the prototypes for the future museum to the Maidan. There, you can see on the right, there is one example of roughly 50 of these installations that were on the space of the Maidan on the 5-year anniversary on February 18, 2018. And they were really all concerned with representation through the museum. So again, the museum becomes so important here in creating a historical play or a place where history can be made or co-created. And the other area that I was very interested in revisiting at this time were the March 8 marches and the Kyiv Pride March, because Feminist Offensiva, this group that I discuss extensively in my third chapter, had started out by forming and planning the first women's march to happen in the independence period in 2010. So I wanted to see where things had gone since then, and the march has expanded to over 3,000 people. It's become also integrated with drones. Here you can see in both marches drones and a virtual march kind of alongside this. The social media, the YouTube postings are all now part of a kind of expanding corpus of material that we can study as integrative civic conversation. And these are very international marches too. Kyiv has become very globalized since 2014. It was always global, but it's become more and more transnational and trans-European, because in 2016, the state and EU signed an agreement that allowed a visa-free travel regime. One of the very positive outcomes of the revolution in 2014, giving the younger generation of artists also the ability to travel to residencies, to present their works, to exhibit their works. But one of the things I have found regularly among artists in Ukraine is complaints that they exhibit their works more often in Europe now than in their own country, and they would like more artist-run spaces. They would like more places to engage with audiences within Ukraine. That's just what I've been hearing in the last 2 years. The last image I will end on in the context of the title of my book, Superfluous Women, which is a literary term that I've reworked. The original term, superfluous man, was a prototype, an archetype of a character from the 1830s, even though the term did not really solidify in Russian letters until the 1850s. So it was applied in retrospect to Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, to Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin from the 1830s. These were men who were very privileged in society and did not participate in the Bolshevik Revolution because they were too young, really, to be a part of those conversations in the 1830s. And they were also too privileged to really understand what discussion was happening around the emancipation of serfs. And I'm reusing this term superfluous women in a tongue-in-cheek way on two levels. One is a similar kind of speaking back to the idea that feminism doesn't matter, that it's a privileged place in society for feminists to be, that they are not relevant somehow, especially, as you will hear, especially in times of war. But I'm also using it in reference to the idea of an invisible man or woman. The Invisible Man, the novel by Ralph Ellison, is one of my favorite books ever written. And his idea there of a double consciousness, of a split consciousness that an African-American man adopts in relation to being marginalized by a predominantly, a white-centered society, is interesting in thinking through the kind of double burden idea of women having to occupy oftentimes contradictory roles, or navigating oftentimes, violence, symbolic violence, physical violence that makes the category, or people who identify maybe as women or trans or non-binary, vulnerable, makes people vulnerable to the idea that they could be superfluous or not valued in society. So that's really where my title's coming from. This monument here by Jana Kadyrova, I include because out of all 68 images, one of the activist figures in my book recently read it, and she seized upon this image and she said this was her favorite out of all of them because it could be anyone under this sheet. The monument is a finished sculpture as it stands here, yet it is finished in unfinished form. And it was installed into a small town in Ukraine, in Shargorod, not in Kyiv, not in a museum. And the artist documented the conversations around the sculpture when she installed it. And one woman had asked her, "Can we make this a monument to my son? I think he deserves to be recognized." And she asked him why. And that conversation was revelatory to her and to the locals. And so I think that in my book also, I hope that what I am doing is really not creating a finished work, not a finished book, that this is still something that can be reworked, and I hope will be rewritten in new forms and new voices and new books, that it's an opening and not a conclusion. And it is very much an honor and a privilege that some of the actors, as we would call them in, I guess, historiography, of my book, they're in the index, but they are also in the acknowledgements. So friendship has been the center of my methodology, and to really befriend others and build solidarity and care networks across a vast history of division is something that I hope that we can do as writers and as scholars. I think in our contemporary moment, we have an opportunity before us and a challenge to do that. So I will end there, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that really wonderful tour through some of the images and stories in your book. It's really inspiring. We do invite the audience members to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we would love to see those, and we'll pose those to Jessica as those come in. I hope no one minds if I start with a question. I know that throughout the book, and this is a conversation actually that, you know, feminist scholars who are particularly interested in this part of the world and in Ukraine have sort of been asking, what kind of feminists are Ukrainian feminists, right? And so there's kind of this underlying question of, can feminists in Ukraine and other post-socialist countries talk to feminists, you know, communicate with feminists that have been, you know, brought up feminists in other contexts? Are they speaking past one another? Are they speaking to one another? Are they all feminists, just feminists of a different stripe? And I know that's something that you're grappling with in your book. So can you just tell us more about kind of these conversations and how, in particular, the art activists, you know, that you're following in your book are grappling with this question of kind of East-West feminism?
Yeah. So I should pay my respects to my predecessors, yourself included, but also Marian J. Rubchak and Marta Bohachevsky-Homiak, who have documented and given shape to the women of the pre-war era who were stepping in and taking over the role of the state in, you know, the interwar period, and reconstructing after World War I. We are here on the centennial of World War I, providing, you know, medicine to people who couldn't access things like that. So there's different ideas of what a feminist is, or what kind of work can be done. There's, you know, care work. There's also, you know, fierce debates around sex work being, you know, parallels of our debates that we have in the US around abortion, but there are different constraints and different possibilities in Ukraine. So I think in building a dialogue, we can focus on some issues that have already been laid out for us by, like, the Beijing conference going way back, that just, they won't go away, because feminists can be conservative feminine, there can be conservative feminists, there can be a left-right spectrum, leftists, those moving more to the right. And I try to give voice to everyone, but I can say that my book is definitely not comprehensive in capturing the voices of conservative feminists. I don't deal with that. And there is more of an emphasis on the left, the history of the historical left, and then also new left and the critical turn after the 1970s and 80s. And so when I'm saying when my idea of feminism is access to the public sphere, and the writings about the public sphere going back to the Frankfurt School, Adorno, but then also Michael Warner's Publics and Counterpublics, and then now Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler, that's really the lineage that I put my book in is this, I guess it is more on the left, this tradition of writing critical theory around what the public sphere is and what does it mean to have access as not being a man, as not man. That's my idea of gender here, is not looking at masculinity either, which is an area that I think needs a lot of work still in thinking through comparatively Ukraine and other sites. And the nation is not my primary lens of engaging with feminism in Ukraine. I know that scholars like Solomia Pavlichko and writers like Oksana Zabushko explicitly discuss what nation is and what nationalism is, and whether it is cohesive with feminism or conflicts with feminism. And I build on Catherine Verdery in that discussion, where she says that feminism in the post-1991 period could be legislated as anti-national, and that only being because in the Soviet era, the Politburo had its ideas about the woman question. And right now in Ukraine, it would be very easy to associate feminism with the Soviet era in this sense. But I am trying to make a clean break, and I think that's what the artists are doing too, by appropriating some Soviet forms and in showing that, well, no, you can't really identify feminism with the Soviet past because we've already taken that up and appropriated that past for ourselves and reworked it. I guess that's what my answer there would be. But it's tough in the climate of decommunization also, I think, to understand what is acceptable speech and not accepted. It's a very difficult moment to be doing research on Ukraine, but it's critical, and it's probably the most interesting moment in my opinion. But I see a question. We have a question. After listening to your great presentation, I'm asking myself, as a man and the husband of Sarah Phillips, what can men do to help facilitate a more respectful "we are all equal" space for women? This is a big step forward for many men. Thank you for this comment. What an honor to answer it. I think you're already doing it. I mean, listening and asking questions, that's the essence of support. And I think the everyday life is a political site that is about negotiating roles, negotiating responsibilities. I find it myself with my husband too. Like we have to share a lot of responsibility, and I'm very interested in new discussions actually around parenting and roles in parenting. There's a great book that was just published, edited by Katalin Fabian at Lafayette University. It's an anthology of parents' rights and discussions around movements, social movements that have emerged throughout many nations. And I'm reading that right now, and I think it's a really great place to look for like different negotiations between genders and supporting different movements. We have
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, that's a great answer to a really great question. And I didn't know of Katalin Fabian's book. I'm going to definitely check that out. Another question just came in from Natalia Shaw. She says, interesting question about the East-West feminism. And she says, I was just sharing my perceptions of the differences between the feminist movement in the US and in Canada in the 1970s and 1980s with a young woman. Then Natalia continues, it might be helpful to define the term whenever using it. I feel that my Ukrainian immigrant mother brought me up as a feminist, but it did not have any political implications in my view. So how would you respond to that, Jessica?
That's really, really interesting. Right now, I am based in Canada, and I'm co-teaching a lecture series at the Alberta Council for Ukrainian Arts with a former student of mine who earned her master's degree in art history. And our theme is contemporary feminist art in Ukraine and Canada. So if you're interested in tuning into that, it's open to the public. So I encourage you, because this is very much a live conversation also between Canada and the US for me right now, and also understanding the histories and legacies of the diaspora. Here, we have in Edmonton, Myrna Kostas and Christa Homiak, who were also very important in the 1970s in creating a housing co-op here that is very successful, thriving today. And I get to enjoy proximity to them and to talking to them live about that past. Yeah, I think my own engagements are also shaped by, in Michigan, where I was working with the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, an organization that goes back 100 years, in helping to connect the community to the university there as well, making our scholarship public and opening up to those who actually are supporting us through endowments too, I think is really important and critical in any kind of discussion around the public sphere and feminism, to stay honest and true to that. And it's not easy, actually, not always easy, because we have now a lot of change in the air. There's a group, UAC, Ukraine Anti-Racist Community. You can find them online. They have a lot of support from scholars throughout North America, and they are spearheading this critical dialogue between the communities, the organizations that date back 100, 200 years, and the project of a contemporary education that keeps pace with changes happening across the ocean. It's a circular project of also migration between cultures, not only intellectually, but physically, many people moving back and forth between states. And my own position is my family is multi-layered. We have Ukrainian identity in my family and Polish identity, and we have German and Anglo. It's a mix, and I think a lot of us in North America have the benefit of that mix of different, and not only in North America, in Europe as well, but we can use that as an asset to understand from multi-perspectives whatever problems we're looking at.
Great, thank you. Jessica, we have another question from our colleague Lada Bilanyuk, who says, one of my favorite sayings that I encountered in Ukraine about gender and power is that the man is the head, but the woman is the neck, meaning the woman can turn the head in the direction she wants. And Lada asks, have you encountered this in your research, either embracing this contradictory idea of gendered power or rejecting it?
Yeah, that's a common quote I found also in Czech and Polish languages. And in my feminism and my approach, I reject that, actually, because I think that it gives too much away to folk wisdom. And I really would love if we could have more images of women as, the intellect. And it's the same reason I reject the concept of a national poet or the primacy of a canon, a cultural canon. I do think it's good to agree on certain, quality and maybe tastes that have widespread significance, but it's too limiting, I think, to put a kind of privileging of thought and the head standing for intellect. I would rather have quotes about Lesa Ukrainka and her folk wisdom, take the place of that particular phrase. Yeah.
We also have one comment from Morris William. He's asking how feminism in Eastern Europe differs from that of African American women.
Great question. Well, right now there is a lot of discussion about post-colonialism in the context of feminism in Ukraine. In fact, if you're interested, there will be a presentation on December 11th here at University of Alberta with two Ukrainian feminists, Olga Plahodnik and Maria Mayerchik, who are also scholars and editors of the journal called Feminist Critique, Feministichna Kritika at Kritika magazine. And they will be dealing with exactly this concept. And I know that Olga Plahodnik is studying here with an African American gender studies professor, so that those comparatives can really be given the nuance they deserve. I am not a specialist in this, but in my view, I think, again, this idea of split consciousness can be useful, that there is an orientalizing of Ukraine that happens in Western discourse. And in my book, I talk about the Western gaze, is the term often given to this, in looking in certain directions at like the figure of, you know, the serf or the concubine. Even these go back to Voltaire. Even like Voltaire was writing in his journal of traveling through the territories now marking contemporary Ukraine on his way to Catherine the Great, and he was writing about his sexual conquest of those territories. These are stereotypes that I think African American women have been subject to very much in North America, and they, you know, have not been compared directly, but I think there could be some nuance here that for fruitful future discussion. So please tune in on December 11 also to that talk.
Jessica, I wanted to ask you about some memory issues that you touched upon in your presentation. And it was a real treat to see all those images that you shared with us today. I'm specifically thinking about that image with an old elderly woman sitting by herself. And to be honest, it's very sad. It's very sad because it's a story of many in Ukraine. Another thing that came to mind is that all the images, including the one that I just mentioned, are staged. In other words, to some extent, this memory is staged and performed to some extent as well. So my question is, what kind of memory is staged and performed, and what kind of memory is probably offered, or what kind of memory is put up front?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the image of the woman that I showed from Gogol Street 32 was taken from my chapter called "The Image is the Frame." And I think the image itself, at least in its later exhibition in Ukraine, was a stage for the performance of its reception. So the dramaturgy of the image and the documentation of how people are responding to it is also part of what these artists I'm talking about are engaged with. They're kind of their own critics, because they're writing about each other and writing about their audiences. And I include some quotes from Natalia Chermalik at the end of my book, writing about watching her students watch a film about Maidan that was made by a group called Babylon 13. Then they were largely amateur film students. And a lot of those images were spontaneous, and they were displays of great emotion around, for example, the dismantling of the Lenin statue. They were filming that, the people around it and what they were saying. And then Natalia was writing about her students watching this film, and the layers of emotion there start to build a kind of chain of association where we can look for patterns of meaning. And I think you're right. It is melancholy. There's a lot of sorrow. There's a lot of there is a lot of loneliness in some of these images, and some of the pain of dragging up the past, but there's also a lot of life in them too. And I think that is, you know, the turn of the generations that we see in these chains of association, that the old and the young are coming together around great changes that are happening in society, that they're not splitting apart, that these are emotions that are shared, even if the experiences are totally different, that everyone relates to the fallen Lenin in a completely different way, because half of the population didn't grow up in the Soviet Union, but the emotion is shared. And I think that's what's really powerful about the artworks, that they're unifying in some way.
Thank you, Jessica. I believe we have one more comment. Annie, do you mind reading out this comment for us?
Just a moment. All right, this comment is a follow-up by Natalia Shao. To be clear, my mother was a member of the educated nationalists who left in 1944, lived for 2 years in displaced persons camp. My parents led the way to finding employment for those living in that camp. She lived her life in a feminist way and transferred these ideas to me. That's what I meant by non-political way, just life.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, that's a very powerful story, and the experience of displacement, I think, today can be felt by those leaving the eastern parts of Ukraine, the occupied zones. And I'm not writing about the war in my book, but there is really good work being done on displacement and gender in Eastern Ukraine. And I know that Tamara Martsenyuk is working on a project, the Invisible Battalion. It's how it's been translated in English. There's also a new report that will be released by Amnesty International coming out in the next week or so about the human rights monitoring that's happening there. I think this is an area that I want to spend more time on and really think through carefully. But yeah, thank you for sharing your story. I think it's very important and relevant to today.
You also mentioned some museum, not museum studies, but still some references to museums, to the National Museum in particular. And I can't but ask this question when the objects from Yanukovych's mansion were brought to the museum. So how would you read this gesture of bringing those objects to the National Museum? And I assume that those objects were kind of a museum objects in Yanukovych's mansion as well. But the difference is that for Yanukovych mansion, it's some sort of a private museum. With the National Museum, it's some sort of a public museum.
Yes, yeah. The exhibit was called Codex Mezihiria, and each room was called by a different book. There was like the book of greed, the book of justice, and the curators had written quite a lot. I don't know how they managed to do it so quickly. They wrote a lot about their ideas. The curators were Alexander Reutberg and Alisa Lozhkina. I thought it was very interesting. They took this figure of a codex because, in history, in historical writing, it would be like a scribe trying to index a character or a person and place them in a time and a frame. So yeah, I think that the gesture was a performative one, and by no means definitive of the National Museum or what they necessarily represent, because it was a project of two curators. But I thought it was, yeah, it was very powerful gesture to have the immediate access to view those objects. I think that the audiences who were there, you didn't need to be an art expert. I mean, most of what was there was a spectacle. It was really astounding to see what had been taken, both ecclesiastical objects of great world value and also absolute kitsch that was created almost in the tastes of a dictator, with quite a bit of narcissism, lots of self-portraits, very quickly done, and to put them, all of these items, like on the same level, I think was a performance of the curators, just to show the contrasts.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us and for sharing your book with us as well. It was a fantastic lecture, and your talk provided us with some insights into Ukrainian feminism and with some venues of how we can understand this concept. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for moderating this talk. We really appreciate your help.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Today it was our final talk for this semester. We will resume our series in January, but please visit our YouTube channel, and all our lectures are available there. For right now, we will say goodbye, but we will see you again in January. And I would like to say thank you to Annie for continuously supporting our technical side and for providing us with her help. Thank you so much, Annie.